Hello and welcome to this Quadrant Chambers Maritime London seminar in partnership with Watson Farley Williams, Brookes Bell and Brookes Bell. I'm Jos Standerwick, I'm Chief Executive of Maritime London, and I will be moderating today's session exploring electric vehicle carriage, fires, safety and legal implications. As we move to a net zero future, so much of the industry's discussions revolve around decarbonised regulation, and the transition of vessels and fuel propulsion systems and the subsequent commercial and safety implications. However, both from safety and legal perspectives, perhaps as important is the cargoes that will be associated with the energy transition. Electric vehicles are increasing their market share year on year and are set to become the dominant form of transport in the near future. As such, the implications and realities of a casualty where an electric vehicle is associated can be very significant. And I'm very pleased to say that we have an excellent panel to walk us through the subject today, because I myself am far from an expert. So we have John Russell, KC from Quadrant Chambers, David Handley from Watson Farley Williams, and Adrian Scales from Brookes Bell. Now we have a small but perfectly formed audience in person today, which is very welcome. But I think we also nearly have 400 people online. And you will all be able to ask questions via the Slido app on your phones. And I think that there is a link online for people to follow and also on the screens for people here in the audience in order to get there. And we will ensure that we have some time at the end of the presentations to be able to field those questions. Just some housekeeping before we start. This session is being recorded and will be shared with the participants after the event. And this is, of course, a live hybrid event. And whilst we have every faith in Sarah and her excellent team from Quadrant, technical issues can occur, so please do bear with us if you should experience any technical difficulties. Right, I think that's all from me for now. And the first presentation is going to be from Adrian, who's going to be looking at the safety challenges associated with lithium-ion vehicles. Adrian, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. So just going to run through some basic information about lithium-ion batteries, and then I'm going to give you a few examples through videos that we've come to light on the internet and everything else that I think raise the point and illustrate what we're trying to say about where the hazards may come from, potentially in the event of a fire and it fails. I'm with Brookes Bell, as mentioned. I'm the Director of Nautical and I'm an SCR. And one of the reasons I'm doing these presentations is having attended a casualty early this year, for which it raised my eyes, having been an ex-master on RoPax vessels, a situation that we couldn't deal with the salvage, we couldn't put the fire out. And so this has really raised this as a problem. So kind of this presentation, the causes, examples of thermal runaway, some challenges with RoPax, and then some food for thought at the end. So what are they? How do they work? So lithium-ion batteries, they are key components: electrodes, electrolyte, and separators. They come in cylindrical, they come in pouch, and they come in prismatic units. During discharge, what you're looking at is between the anode and the cathode, the ions flow in one direction during discharge, and during charging, they flow in the opposite direction. And there's a safety barrier between the two sides. That barrier, obviously, is the safety key. It's 30 microns thick. And the key point about that barrier is over time, it will wear down. It will become less effective than it should be. Some examples here: cylindricals, as you can see on the picture on the left. When you're talking about batteries, you're looking at a multitude, lots and lots of batteries in a single unit, coupled together, connected. So whereas your phone may be a small single unit battery, when we're talking about vehicles and the bigger units we're talking about, it's a series of batteries connected together, and each one then has a connection point which may fail. Why do they pose a fire risk? Well, when you're talking about the key point at the end of this is thermal runaway. The thermal runaway is the point the battery is actually failing. And they can fail through mechanical abuse, electrical abuse, and then thermal abuse. So you can drop them and you can have problems. Or as I've heard, the latest one I've heard through at the moment is in the States, where they've had the flash floods through the storm surges. Electric vehicles parked on the road have been submerged in salt water. And now the fire departments are having problems because the batteries with the corrosion levels are starting to go into thermal runaway because the corrosion of the batteries is taking place. Something that we never thought about in the past, but there's been at least 100 cases in recent weeks. Put that on a ship, that could be an even bigger problem. Thermal runaway, self-sustaining reaction. It's very rapid. I'll show you a video shortly to tell you that. Gets extremely hot, difficult to extinguish. And the key point here that I want to raise to everybody in the room is with a thermal runaway event, it is not smoke that you are seeing. There are lots of videos online showing people talking about smoke coming from vehicles, smoke coming from batteries, smoke coming from things. It's not smoke. And if you look at the screen and look at what we've got here, what we're talking about is hydrogen, which we all know is flammable, 30 to 50%. But you've got hydrogen fluorides, hydrogen cyanides, hydrogen chlorides. It's a vapor cloud. And when we want to put this in a little bit of context, between 300 and 6,000 litres of vapor will come from a 1 kilowatt battery. 3,000 to 6,000 litres of vapor. You think about a Tesla, which is about 100 kilowatts, 600,000 litres of toxic vapor that you're talking about from that battery when it goes into Farley. So when does it occur? Now, research, talking to the National Fire Chiefs Council, maybe 1.5% of all vehicles may have a problem. And from those 1.5% of vehicles, they fail when they're either parked or generally charging, 50% when they're charging or when they're parked. This is one of the key points we're looking at is the charging side of things. When we talk about ships, the one thing we say at the moment is we don't know that well how it happens. So why would we charge on a ship? Let's leave the charge until we know a little bit more about what's going on. There's a lot of conversions going on at the moment. Buses are a key one. The hybrid buses coming through, but they're putting the batteries on the roof. And I'll show a video very shortly of what are the hazards that come out of this. So this is in Paris this year in April. Just see the battery just failed now. And then it starts to go into thermal runaway. This is molten aluminium pouring off the top of that coach. Now, the point and the reason I put this video into this presentation is that the hybrid buses are carrying people across the channel at the moment, backwards and forwards. If this happened on a ship, you would be able to do nothing about it on a ferry. It's going to go, it's within a minute or so, it's kicked off and it's running through. And then it's generating an awful lot of smoke, an awful lot of plumes of smoke, all of which are going to be collected on the car decks, blocking visibility and the heat transfer that's going from there. So as I said, difficult to distinguish, very time consuming, difficult to knock down. And one of the problems we're hearing about now is when they do go into thermal runaway, because they're a battery, the cars can start moving on their own. I have a colleague that has a Tesla, and he drives it down his drive to save walking up the side of his house to pull his car out. He can drive it on his thing. It's the same sort of problem. You can have these cars can start moving. And reignition will occur up to 1 to 2 days after it started. There's a thought, you stick them in a container full of water, that'll control it. But Tesla actually say don't do it. This is from the Tesla Model 3 unit. They say do not put it in the water because what they're concerned about is actually then making the tank, the water you put it into, electrifies. That's a bit of a problem that's going through. Fire blankets are brilliant if you're in an open field, not on a ship. It won't work on a ship. You're never going to get anywhere near the car that's gone into thermal runaway. Firefighting. Now, the ship I attended earlier this year, the ship's crew had the, as I would call them, the Baco foil suits as their fire equipment on board the ship, the ones that cook you from the inside out when you're wearing it. So if you're dealing with some of these fires, the last thing we want to be seeing is the problems in the suits. And the crews just don't have the equipment they need. You're looking at emergency defibrillators. If one of these cars goes up, you could have an electrocution problem. You need electrical gloves, and the UK Fire Service now have electrical fire gloves on their thing. What they didn't used to have is gas meters. They didn't know what gases they might have been dealing with. So that's a bit of an issue as well. Fire suits and pulling people out. So what we've got is, this is an example of a battery that's gone into thermal runaway in a parking slot. The key point here is look at the smoke or the fumes running across the floor. Look at the fumes going into the headspace. Look at the quantity of fumes coming through. When it flares off, because of the hydrogen, it goes into the thermal runaway, and you're looking at a fire very quickly. But that's a real-time video. You're talking seconds from the start to the finish of what's going on. This video, I think, is if you look around the vehicle on the right-hand side, this is on charge. You just see the vapors starting to generate coming through. So the battery's gone into thermal runaway, but this is the key point. The batteries are on the bottom of the vehicles. When it starts, when it actually ignites, watch the thing. So there's the ignition. look at the fumes. The fumes are all drawn back in and consumed by the fire under the vehicle. And it's fine. But the key point here is the fire blanket situation. Could you actually go and put a fire blanket over the top of this vehicle if it's doing what it's doing now? But again, this is a real-time video. It's about 1.5 minutes, but you've got the first vehicle's on fire, the one adjacent to it's on fire. Put this in the context of a Ropax, RoRo, PCTC. You're talking 30, 40 centimeters between vehicles. In this case, the truck that's alongside, it's on fire within less than a minute. Then the super yachts. This is a key area we're trying to raise at the moment. But in the last 12 months, there's been 16 super yacht fires. A lot of this, we believe, could be down to the toys that are on board, the units, the scooters, and the problem we've got going. And I think if you just look at the intensity of this fire, we cannot say whether this was an EV because everything is being consumed. But the likelihood is it could be. That's the end of the day. We don't know. But the 16 super yachts are going down. And we're now working with that industry as well to try and raise the profile of how do you contain it? Where are you putting the toys? Where are they being stored? Are they in a space you can flood? What are you doing with them? So some specific challenges and some of the video or some of the photographs I've got in this next section are of a case I did this year, just to show you the intensity of the fire that we were dealing with. What's the problem with the RoRo? And this is the key point. If you think about a container ship, you're talking about vertical holds. You can maybe flood them with water. You can maybe flood them with foam to try and contain the fire. With a RoRo, Ropax, PCTC, you're talking a longitudinal deck. Therefore, you're talking an oven. If the fire starts in that deck, it's going to go one way. You can't flood from the top because your stability is a big issue with putting water into it. Again, PCTCs, longitudinal decks, PCTC, big differences, not necessarily a water containment side of things. You're talking about CO2 on a space. Limited supply maybe covers 3 decks if it spreads very quickly with the temperatures you're talking about. The other challenge you might have, again, we don't know yet. Blizzard TA's had a problem this year. The decks between zones are aluminium. If one of these vehicles is burning, it's a pure aluminium deck. Melting point, Nick will be able to confirm that, but melting point of pure aluminium is what, 600 degrees? And these cars are burning at 900,000 degrees, potentially a fire. So are you going to lose the decks between the decks as they melt or as they distinguish as they run through? Looking at the rope axis, again, gaps between the cars, being able to move around, low headspace. If one of these goes into thermal runaway, are you going to get anywhere near that vehicle? Are you going to be able to do anything about the vehicle? What options have you got? And the answer realistically is not a great deal. And for me, one of the key points, and this is my old ship when I was master on the Irish Sea, and one of the key points is where we talk back to the fumes, talk about the toxic vapors. If it generates 600,000 litres of vapor in a thermal runaway in a single Tesla vehicle, and you get 4 or 5 of these, you're talking millions of potential litres of toxic fumes coming out. If your passenger cars are parked on the top deck and it's an open top deck as on this ship, where are all those fumes going other than to atmosphere after the back end of the deck? And what have you got around the back end of the deck? Your lifeboats, your life-saving equipment. So do we need to have a rethink about the approach we have if you know it's a thermal runaway event, if you see all these smoke toxic fumes? We need to be explaining to the crews, one, you don't want to go into the deck because you might not come back out again, but you've also got to consider your passengers, you've got to consider your crews, which is your means of escape, where's it going to come from? Again, this is a PCTC photo, how are you going to go through? And of course, if you've got flames burning on the bottom of the car, your lashings are going to burn very quickly. Cars are going to start moving about at an early stage? And are you going to get anywhere near a car in the middle of that stove? And a key point I should say is the OEMs, we've talked to a few OEMs and carriers, and we've been saying we need a sticker on the windscreen because you can't see number plates, you can't see to tell you whether it's an internal combustion, an ICE, a hybrid, or a full EV car. You can't tell, you can't see. And apparently it's too expensive to put a sticker on the windscreen of a vehicle to give you an indication of what you're actually dealing with, a single sticker. That's what we're trying to push for. Just running through some of the pictures. One example, and the picture on the left, you see there are the trucks on the car deck. This is one of the things we talk about when you're trying to access a RoRo deck in the event of a fire. Is a RoRo lane is generally 3.2 meters wide, and a truck is about 3 meters wide in the current incarnations as they are. Cars and trucks, everything is getting bigger. If the trucks are in the middle of the lane, you might have 40 centimeters gap between them you can walk through. Now, my shoulders are 44 centimeters wide. And so I know that going between two trucks at 40 centimeters, I've got to go on an angle. I put a BA set on my back, I'm crabbing to go down the gap. But that's only if the truck is exactly where it needs to be in the middle of a lane. If you put the truck slightly closer together, you can't get down the lane. So when you're talking about going into a car deck to try and fight the fire, the challenge is you might be able to do one truck or two trucks length before you've got to cross in front of a truck and move again. And if you're trying to put a fire hose down that route in, you can't charge the hose until you're actually got the hose laid out between all the trucks. And then you're going to enter a space with a hose. And the last thing is the BA sets. Most BA sets on ships give you a duration of about 20 minutes of air. Now, 20 minutes of air to get in and get out again, if you're going to go and try and do something. Key point, thermal runaway. When the battery goes into thermal runaway, it can take between 3 seconds, 4 seconds, and 2 minutes before everything is burning away. Put it in the context of a ship's crew, normal muster time from the event of an incident being identified to the crew being mustered and getting ready to fight a fire, 8 and 12 minutes. You're not going to get the chance to get in and move on it. Stability problems, drencher systems, great system, cooling, putting water on the deck, cooling things down. But you've got to be careful how much water you're putting on the deck. Example here of the fire on the road I was talking about earlier. This is a thermal imaging camera taken at the stage, but you can see how much heat is within the car deck, longitudinal car deck, that you cannot get to because there's a steel canopy over the top of it and you're rocking from the inside. This is the fire that helped when we had to open the stern door because we couldn't get around the deck because even the salvage firefighters didn't have enough air in the bottles to get all the way around the car deck because of the way the stove was without climbing over bits and pieces in an atmosphere. And this was 40 minutes after opening the door. This is what we're faced with now. Stability calculation said no more than 300 tons of water could be put on that car deck to put the fire up. UK Fire Service say let the cars burn. On this one, we had to let the ship burn because we couldn't actually physically fight the fire on the ship with the door open. It was too hot, too intense, and that's a really big problem. And just something for food for thought is some of the EVs now are also having LPG or propane tanks. And this little video, this is from the Netherlands. The key point, once the fire really got going and they got to the other fuel tank, it became a flamethrower. And the concern I have with that is these are the types of buses that may well be on your ferries. They may well be on the cross-channel ferries. And if this happens, you have got no hope of dealing with it. But all it will do is spread exceptionally quickly. And again, we're only saying there's a potential of this happening. We hope it never does happen. And I'm just trying to raise the profile of this as a situation, along with David and the team, that we need to be prepared to see this. And what we don't want is another Titanic type event caused by one of these, because we don't understand the technology. The technology is changing so fast, we don't know where. So thank you, and I'll pass it on to David.
Wow, Adrian, thanks very much for that. I must admit, I've only seen the slides and still, up until now, slightly taken aback by some of the videos that we've just seen, I must say. And as you were saying, I think the more people, the more cargo owners, insurers, lawyers, consultants that can see these sorts of things, and also the manufacturers of the vehicles themselves, the better, quite frankly. So thank you very much for that presentation. I'd now like to pass over to Johnny, who's going to talk about the legal aspects of carrying electric vehicles. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Jos. I'm afraid that's the end of the videos for the moment. There aren't very many videos of the heated arguments that took place in the 1920s when they were debating the wording of the Hague Rules. But I hope that my talk will at least identify some of the legal issues that arise out of the carriage of EVs. What I'll do is give an overview of the different liability regimes first of all, and then discuss some of the legal problems that are likely to arise as cases start coming through courts and arbitrations. So in terms of the liability regimes, particularly where cars are being carried on PCTCs, there is obviously freedom of contract. There'll be charter parties in place. There will be space sharing agreements in place and so forth. And very often those terms will be bespoke terms. The parties are free to agree a liability regime and indemnity regimes as they see fit. Though very often those bespoke regimes will either incorporate Hague or Hague-Visby rules, or will use concepts that are found in the rules. And so hopefully the discussion that we'll have about the Hague and Hague-Visby rules will also be of some relevance to bespoke regimes. Secondly, we have the Hague regime, and that will generally apply where cars are being carried pursuant to bill of lading contracts. And then thirdly, and perhaps a little bit unusually for sort of commercial maritime lawyers, there will be a lot of cases where cars are being carried on ro-ro ferries or ro-pax ferries, where the Athens Convention will apply, both domestically as a matter of domestic legislation and also as a matter of the application of the convention itself. And in this talk, it's principally the Hague regime and then the Athens Convention regime that I'm going to look at. So a quick overview of the relevant provisions of the Hague regime. You've got two principal obligations on the carrier. The Article 3, Rule 1 obligation to exercise due diligence to make the vessel seaworthy before and at the commencement of the voyage. Secondly, you then have the Article 3, Rule 2 obligation to take reasonable care of the cargo, often referred to simply as the care of cargo obligation. Then you have the fire exception in Article 4(2)(b), which is an exception to the care of cargo obligation, but not an exception to the overriding Article 3, Rule 1 obligation to exercise due diligence to make the vessel seaworthy. And then we have Article 4, Rule 6, which is the dangerous goods indemnity. And one of the key questions or key issues is going to be how those various provisions interact with each other, and which is if you like, the overriding or dominant provision. Before we look at those, just a consideration of how dangerous electric vehicles are in terms of the legal framework. It seems to me that, as Adrian has very clearly illustrated, the EVs certainly constitute a different kind of danger to internal combustion engine vehicles. And that means that they do give rise, it seems to me, to different questions of dangerousness in relation to whether they're dangerous goods or not. And they also give rise to different considerations when we consider unseaworthiness and also what ship owners, carriers must do to demonstrate that they've exercised due diligence. I think a difficult question is whether fires are more likely in the carriage of EVs, and if fires are more likely, in what circumstances and why. And in relation to this, I think the evidential picture is unclear. There is London Fire Brigade data which suggests that the fire rate in electric vehicles is considerably higher than the risk of fire in internal combustion engine vehicles. The figures that have been published under a Freedom of Information Act request are 0.1 for EVs as against 0.04 for ordinary vehicles. But these are relatively small numbers. In 2019, the London Fire Brigade only had to deal with 54 electric vehicle fires. And there is other published material that suggests that there may not be a significant risk in terms of the likelihood of a fire happening between electric vehicles and ICE vehicles. And in any event, what is clear is that while when a fire does take place, it is very, very dangerous and very dramatic, as we've seen from the slides. In percentage terms, the risk is still small. I think a key factor when we come to look at the application of the legal provisions to the facts is that a serious risk element is likely to be damage to the battery or the condition of the battery. And that will mean that some EVs are more dangerous than others. It's not every electric vehicle obviously is going to catch fire, but it also poses a difficulty in terms of identifying which vehicles potentially represent the greater risk. And that is important, I think, when we consider the different legal tests that apply in relation to unseaworthiness and the dangerous goods indemnity. So I think we can deal with Article 3.2 and Article 4.2b quite quickly. Article 3.2 is the obligation, as I say, to properly and carefully care for the goods, but that is subject to the fire exception, and therefore, in most cases, liability under 3.2 isn't going to be a factor because the fire exception will apply. There's potentially quite an interesting little question as to whether the initial thermal runaway event constitutes a fire or not. It's certainly a chemical reaction, but in the initial stages, as Adrian was saying, you have poisonous gases, but not smoke. And there's the old sort of chestnut as to whether you can have a fire without smoke or not. But I think that potentially an interesting question isn't going to arise in reality, because the amount of heat that is being generated is such that pretty soon something catches fire. And so that's not something we need to worry about. And as I say, therefore, I think we can put the Article 3.2 obligation to one side fairly quickly. The Article 3.1 obligation, overriding obligation of seaworthiness, is that the carrier is bound before and at the beginning of the voyage to exercise due diligence, basically to make the vessel seaworthy. And then I've set out the rather densely worded dangerous goods provision in Article 4.6, and I've highlighted in colour the bits that really matter for present purposes, which is that so dangerous goods are essentially defined as being goods of an inflammable, explosive, or dangerous nature. I think having seen Adrian's videos, there's no doubt that EVs would fall into that category, or potentially fall into that category. And if the carrier, master or agent, hasn't consented to the carriage of dangerous goods with knowledge of their nature and character, we'll come back to what that might mean, then the shipper of such goods shall be liable for all damage and expenses directly or indirectly arising out of or resulting from such shipment. So putting it in very basic terms, if dangerous goods are shipped and the shipper doesn't warn the carrier of their nature and character, then the shipper will be liable to the carrier by way of an indemnity for all damage and expenses indirectly or directly arising from the shipment. So those are the provisions. In relation to unseaworthiness, the test for unseaworthiness is what's known as the prudent owner test. The question is whether a prudent owner would have required the relevant defect had he known of it to be made good before sending the ship to sea. But defect isn't limited to defects in the ship. The recent Supreme Court case decision in the Libra has made it clear that the presence of dangerous cargo on board a ship can of itself render the ship unseaworthy. So if you have cargo that's liable to catch fire, that of itself can render the ship unseaworthy. It's also important to remember that defective systems can render the ship unseaworthy. So if you have a defective firefighting system, that can render the ship unseaworthy. And I think if we combine the first 2 points, it also means that if a ship doesn't have a proper system for preventing dangerous cargo getting on board, that can render the ship unseaworthy. And then that is relevant when we come to the exercise of due diligence. And then thirdly, a crew that aren't properly trained and instructed can render a ship unseaworthy. And again, that will apply to firefighting, if that's a necessary skill, just as much as any other aspect of the operation of the ship. So unseaworthiness is certainly a wide concept in this context. Due diligence, because remember the obligation is to exercise due diligence to make the vessel seaworthy. It is simply an exercise of reasonable care. It's the flip side of negligence. If you're not negligent, then you have exercised due diligence. But importantly here, I think it is relevant to note that simply complying with a regulatory framework may not be enough to demonstrate the exercise of due diligence in a rapidly developing state of knowledge. And so, for example, there was a consultation that the British government undertook 2021 and 2022, leading to the publication of a guidance note, which I think David will talk about it in more detail. But in the consultation, it was noted that IMO regulations are likely to lag behind industry knowledge. And so simply saying, well, we've complied with all of the strict requirements, strict regulations, isn't going to be enough. I think that to demonstrate that they've exercised due diligence, carriers are going to have to carry out detailed, in-depth risk assessments, looking at all the available guidance, including obviously P&I Club guidance, marine guidance notes, and I suspect also, in fact, taking advice from independent experts and consultants to ensure that best systems that are currently available are in place, even if they are not required by regulation. So, dangerous goods. I think that the important point to note here is that the standard that attaches in relation to the shipper's obligation not to ship dangerous goods is one of strict liability rather than a standard of due diligence. So if a shipper ships dangerous goods and doesn't warn the carrier of their nature and character, it is no defense for the shipper to say that he or she didn't know of the dangerous character of the goods. I think this may be particularly relevant when we come to considering the shipment of a particular vehicle that catches fire because the battery was damaged or corroded in some way. Because it may be that the shipper has done everything they could, exercising reasonable care, to ensure that the vehicles are in good condition and don't pose a fire risk, and may even warn the carrier that that there's a general risk in relation to EVs. But if you have an EV, a particular EV that has suffered damage to the battery and is therefore a particular fire risk, it seems to me that at least arguably, is a specific dangerous good, which could give rise to liability pursuant to the indemnity, even though the shipper couldn't have found that out by exercising reasonable care. And so the difference in standard between the unseaworthiness obligation of due diligence and the strict liability under the dangerous goods indemnity, I think may be important and a risk for shippers. So in relation to EVs, what constitutes unseaworthiness? Well, it seems to me that any vehicle which in fact catches fire will mean that the vessel was unseaworthy at the commencement of any leg on which that vehicle was on board. Because if you have a vehicle which in fact catches fire and was therefore liable to catch fire during the voyage, it seems to me inevitable that if you apply the prudent owner test, the prudent owner would say, well, I'm not having that car on board my vessel. And therefore the unseaworthiness part of the test, I think, is going to be quite easily satisfied in cases where there is a fire. And therefore the focus is going to be on due diligence, which I'll come on to next. What about carriage of EVs that don't catch fire? This is perhaps more of a theoretical possibility, because in the sense that if they don't catch fire, there's going to be no claim for damage or anything of that nature. It seems to me that there may be circumstances in which it's still relevant if you have a warranty that the vessel will be seaworthy, and breach of that warranty might arguably give rise to a right to terminate a charter party or space sharing agreement. There could be some circumstances in which the carriage of a vehicle that doesn't catch fire could be relevant, but I think that's going to be quite a niche area. Before I come to due diligence, one very important aspect is the relationship between a breach of Article 3.1 if due diligence hasn't been exercised, and the indemnity under 4.6. And the important point here is that Article 3.1 is an overriding obligation, and the indemnity does not apply where there has been a breach of the Article 3.1 obligation. And so that means unless, if you have an EV fire, unless the carrier can demonstrate that he has exercised due diligence and therefore is not in breach of Article 3.1, he is never going to be able to rely on the indemnity. And therefore, it significantly reduces what might appear to be the wide wording and force of the indemnity so far as carriers are concerned. And therefore, I think that the right sequencing, if there's been a fire, is can the carrier prove that he has exercised due diligence? And then a consideration of whether the indemnity is engaged. Because if the carrier can't prove that he has exercised due diligence, he's going to be in breach of Article 3.1. He's going to be liable for damage to all other vehicles on board, and he's not going to be able to rely on the indemnity. So the exercise of due diligence is going to be a fact-sensitive question, and also it's going to be a developing area. I think the most important question is whether a carrier has to refuse to carry electric vehicles at all. You might say that it's too much of a risk, given the difficulty in fighting an EV fire, to have any EVs on board at all. It seems to me that that probably goes too far. There's a commercial need to carry electric vehicles. But I think the flip side of that is that there will be a high threshold in terms of exercising due diligence in putting in place systems for identifying EVs, identifying any damaged batteries, and for fighting fires. And as Adrian says, at the moment, it's very difficult to see how a fire can be safely and properly fought if a fire catches or takes hold on board. But I think that there will be an onus on carriers to show that at the very least, they have, as I say, carried out very detailed risk assessments, taken all the advice that they can from guidance and independent experts, and put in place the very best systems that they can to demonstrate that they've exercised due diligence. And it seems to me that really it's going to be proactive on carriers to require shippers to provide as much information as they can about the vehicles. So, for example, most basically whether it is an EV or not, but also drilling down into more detail, finding out where for each particular vehicle in a particular location on the vessel, where the battery is situated, so that they know how best to fight fire if they can get to the vehicle in time. There are, I think it's London Fire Brigade has an app which, when they identify the model of the car, identifies precisely where in the car the lithium-ion batteries are, and so they can have at least some sort of idea as how best to fight the fire. So as I say, it seems to me that it's unlikely that a carrier will be held to have failed to exercise due diligence just by having an EV on board. But there is going to be a heavy onus to ensure that all the best firefighting systems are put in place. So then moving on to the consideration of dangerous goods. As I say, it seems to me that an EV that in fact catches fire clearly does constitute dangerous goods. And just to recap, we're now talking about a situation where the ship owner or the carrier has managed to demonstrate that they've exercised due diligence. So there's no breach of Article 3.1. The question is whether the shipper is then liable. And the question is, to what does the carrier have to consent? If the carrier has consented to the carriage simply of electric vehicles, is that enough to relieve the shipper from any liability under the indemnity because the carrier has consented? Or does the carrier have to have consented to the carriage of an EV that will in fact catch fire? So in other words, if the shipper is to avoid the consequences of the indemnity, is it necessary for the shipper to have identified that a particular vehicle is the one that's going to catch fire? Now, that obviously sounds unrealistic, because such a vehicle is never going to be carried if so declared. But I think that that is going to be certainly, I think, a topic of litigation in terms of identifying the scope of the indemnity and whether it's enough for the shipper to avoid liability by simply making it clear that electric vehicles are being shipped, or whether where one vehicle in fact turns out to be particularly dangerous, the shipper will be liable, because of course it's a strict liability indemnity, and it's no defense for the shipper to say, well, I couldn't have found out in advance that that was the one that was going to catch fire. So I think that will be one area where litigation will be necessary to determine the outcome. So that's what I was going to say about the Hague regime. Very briefly, the Athens Convention, in completely different regime. Definitions are relevant. The passenger's vehicle is luggage. But I say probably not cabin luggage usually. Slightly different regime applies to cabin luggage. The regime differentiates between shipping incidents and non-shipping incidents. But an EV fire will be a shipping incident, because shipping incident includes fire in the ship. So we're in the shipping incident regime. And the regime there is that there is essentially strict liability for personal injury or death, up to 250 SDRs. That's because the limited exceptions to the strict liability regime won't apply. And above that, strict liability limit in respect to personal injury or death, and for the loss of luggage, the test is whether the carrier proves that the incident which caused the loss occurred without the fault or neglect of the carrier. And if one thinks about it, really that's the same test as the Article 3, Rule 1 due diligence test, just expressed in a different way. It seems to me that very similar issues will arise in relation to Athens Convention cases as in relation to Hague cases. It's the same standard, and the burden of proof is on the carrier in both cases. But of course, in the Athens Convention case, there's no equivalent of the dangerous goods indemnity, so that side of the equation doesn't apply. Thank you.
John, thank you very much for that. I think taking your presentation and Adrian's in tandem, perhaps, I can see a number of issues regarding due diligence, particularly after you've seen a video like that and you wonder whether your vessel is actually suitable for carrying EVs at all, potentially. But also in the sort of the understanding of the risk area, I suppose, and the obligations of both the carrier and the shipper, where you have novel technologies developing all the time. Can you ever sufficiently understand that risk and be sure that you are enacting that due diligence to the best of your abilities? And I think there are some quite significant issues there that you've brought up in your presentation that maybe not today because time is ticking on, but perhaps we should explore further another time. But right now, I'd like to pass over to David, who's going to be talking about emergency procedures on board vessels should an EV fire occur. And I think you'll be touching on MGN guidelines here, David, which is good because we've already got a couple of questions on them. So over to you.
Okay, so I haven't prepared a whole load of slides. In fact, I've prepared a single slide, mainly because my purpose is to mop up some of the issues that John and Adrian haven't expanded on. And one of the things I think is important to talk about is MGN 653. So I got interested in this subject about 18 months ago, and over the period of the last 18 months, I've had various conversations with people that represent different parts of the industry, owners, operators, ex-mariners like myself, current mariners, people that represent the insurers, people that represent liability insurers. I think one of the things that has characterized those conversations is in the absence of certainty, there's become a tribalization. and each of the individual interested parties are interested in their own section. And the problem with that is that if that continues, we're never going to solve any of these issues, particularly thinking about the issue of a carrier asking for some stickers, something as simple as stickers to be put on the windscreen so that they can identify whether they're carrying internal combustion engine vehicles or electric vehicles. And any one of you can go into a main manufacturer's showroom now and purchase a purely electric equivalent of an internal combustion engine vehicle. So crews are going to have no chance when they go onto a vehicle deck at 2 o'clock in the morning that's covered in that's filled with smoke, in identifying which are EVs or which are ICE vehicles and which are hybrids. And that's an issue. And some of the tribalisation appears to have come into the thinking behind MGN 653. You can see that different interested parties have had access to drafting different sections of the regulation. I think what we should be clear on immediately is none of us on the panel are saying that electric vehicles are inherently more dangerous than internal combustion engine vehicles. The statistics are entirely uncertain about that. Until we have some certainty of those statistics, we must assume that the threshold of safety is similar. But what we are saying is the character and nature with which you fight the fires of an electric vehicle are entirely different. And that has to be taken into account in the carriage. So taking a couple of examples in the MGN, it says that the master has the discretion to decide whether charging is allowed on board his vessel. That seems entirely insane to me. It seems insane not simply because it shouldn't be the master's discretion, but the regulation then goes on, or the guidance note then doesn't go on to give him any guidance on how to make that assessment. It just says make a risk assessment. Well, you know, we've spoken to battery scientists, we've spoken to professors at universities, we've spoken to all manner of people, and there isn't a consensus view on how one would go about making that risk assessment. So to put it in the hands of the master seems to me a little bit unfortunate. And what master is going to be able to make that decision sensibly? Ultimately, he's going to bow to the pressures of the desire of the, you know, particularly with road packs, to the desire of passenger service, I would say. You read through the M notice and it seems to be internally inconsistent. At one point, it says that no changes should be made to the firefighting procedures, none whatsoever. And then it goes on to enumerate a whole list of changes in a separate section. It just doesn't seem to make much sense. And I asked a colleague of mine, a mariner lawyer, whether it was possible for a SOLAS-classed vessel to be unseaworthy, because it seems that for a vessel that complies with all of the regulation to be unseaworthy as a matter of course seems to be a little bit insane. But this question was posed as a result of a conversation that Adrian and I had, which was a freight ferry operating across the North Sea that has 2 self-contained breathing apparatus sets and 2 spare cylinders. With 20 minutes on air, you're essentially limiting yourself to going and investigating and abandoning ship. Now, I'm not sure that the insurance industry will be so pleased to know that the regulations are at such a high standard that essentially the crew can make no real attempt at firefighting. And bearing in mind the amount of vapor that's caused by one of these fires, it's utterly essential that there's sufficient breathing apparatus sets and BA cylinders on board for the crew to be able to get to the seat of the fire, to at least work out what is the next step, even if the next step is to abandon ship. It seems to me we're in a position where it might well be fire detected, go to the lifeboats, because we just simply don't have the capacity on some vessels to be able to sensibly attack the fire. There's no mention of the cargo securing manual in the MGN. Well, we've seen in Adrian's photographs flammable lashings used. Well, one of the key elements of danger is physical damage to the batteries. Well, if you have a fire and the fire melts or damages the integrity of the lashings in some way, then are you actually setting off a chain reaction whereby the lashings all melt or disappear, and you get further battery failures because the stow is unstable? I think that was a concern that you've raised. It seems to me that some of these issues could well have been addressed, and even if they were addressed in a way, well, we don't have any certainty, so make sure you do your own risk assessment, make sure you update your own safety management procedures. I do wonder whether there's a need, particularly on the short sea trade, including passengers now, to think about some kind of OPA 90 response, whereby you have firefighting services contracted prior to you ever needing them for passenger ferries. We know that over the years that there's been a mixed success on fire brigades attacking fires on board ferries. Maybe it's time for the discussion to widen and to talk about whether actually it's necessary to have a pre-engaged firefighting company that has the techniques and the equipment and the ability to tackle these fires properly. Which brings me on to some of the other points that I said I'd discuss. So emergency response, the international group have recently released their report on the engagement of salvage services and the delay. If one of these incidents actually occurs, the question will be how quickly will the owners respond, which contract will they respond to, who will they go to for the provision of services. I would suggest that in all of these cases, time and time again, prudent overreaction has been proven to be the correct method to adopt. So even in the early stages, signing an LOF pretty quickly, I would say, would be, in most circumstances, the correct thing to do. It's unlikely that you're going to be able to attack these fires without professional firefighting assistance. I think Adrian will probably have something to say on that when I've finished speaking, having actually seen the professionals at work in casualty you attended last summer. I think one of the things that there should be some resistance to is to try and negotiate some form of commercial contract in the outset, because you've seen the speed at which these fires occur and the potential for the increase of the severity of the situation. And I think it's also going to be important because one of the other issues that we've talked about is both ports of refuge and waste reception facilities. So for port of refuge, you've seen this significant amount of smoke coming off the fires. One of the criteria that the ports and the port states have to take into account is the hazard to human health. So don't think it's necessarily going to be just towing this thing back into Dover or Stranraer or wherever it's come from. That's not necessarily going to be the case. So there's going to be a deal of work to be dealt with ports of refuge. That's probably best done with an organisation that are used to trying to get vessels into ports of refuge. After the event, where you take it to is going to be incredibly important because there's going to be a huge amount of waste on board. So one of the biggest difficulties to deal with will be the fully burnt cars are actually going to be probably the easiest part of the stow to deal with. It's those that are partially burnt that will need some kind of waste reception facility. Wreck removal. I think there's probably not much to be said about wreck removal because I suspect the vessels will either, because of the nature of these events, they'll either be make it back to port or they'll sink under the weight of firefighting water. And there is one final point, because I know time's racing on and there are lots of questions. There's one final point that I want to make, which I think is important. I initially became really interested in this because of the fact that this can involve members of the public. You know, RoPax ferries carry thousands of members of the public every single day. I think we shouldn't forget that the ferry companies are under an legal obligation to make sure that they're organising their operations in a way that don't endanger the public. I am not suggesting for a second that they are. But we need to remember that the Corporate Manslaughter Act is now 15 years old. It came into effect largely as a result of the pressure that was put on successive governments as a result of the Herald of Free Enterprise and the various rail crash cases, Potter's Bar and Hatfield being two in particular. And if there was an event involving electric vehicles, which resulted in significant loss of life in the ferry industry, I think everyone's policies and procedures would come under scrutiny. And no ferry operator wants to have the very famous memo that Mr. Justice Sheen found in his report on the Herald of Free Enterprise, which I believe one of the superintendents had written on the top when the masters asked for warning lights to make sure that the car doors were closed, was nice. Next, they'll be asking for a warning light to tell them the bosun is sober and awake, which was really quite prescient. But I think that one has to be careful that sensible steps are being taken to not eliminate the risk. We don't live in a world where risk is possible to be eliminated, but certainly risk is minimized, and that needs to be done with the vehicle manufacturers, the ferry operators, the regulators, and people that come and attend seminars like this.
David, thanks very much for that. Now we have got 2 minutes left. I think we're allowed to go slightly over. Is that right, Sarah? So what I'm going to do, and probably I'm going to fail at doing this, is try and put together some of the questions. And we've received an awful lot of questions on the Slido. And so I'll ask 3 questions from Slido, and then we'll open it up to a couple of questions from the floor, if anybody has any questions from the floor as well. I think the first question, and it's one that's been reoccurring on the Slido, and I think this is probably only pertinent to PCTC vessels rather than to RoPax. I think RoPax represents actually an even more significant issue in the long term. Is really the only answer, particularly in the case of due diligence, is to look at new vessel designs where the risk can be mitigated to a greater level and a greater extent than can currently be done. Adrian, perhaps start with you on that one.
I think technology is with us, and the design of the ships needs to change a little bit for the carriage of these vehicles. But I think there's a method that should be looked at and at least considered. And the method I'm looking at, as I mentioned earlier, most people that I know that have got an EV or a hybrid have an app on their phone that talks to the vehicle. And I think we should be looking at now, as quickly as possible, a means where the data that is coming from the car to that mobile phone is collectible on a ship, on a bridge, so that in the event of something going wrong with the vehicle on board, you know before it's actually happening. So if there's a thermal runaway event, if that car is having a problem, the batteries are starting to change, there's something, a status change within that vehicle, the ship knows as quickly as possible, because the technology is obviously there because people have it on their mobile phones already on an individual basis. My view is we should be trying to tap into that from the manufacturers so that the ships are protected, because we're only talking a cruise of 25 on a PCTC or 60 on a RoPax. They haven't got many crew, and therefore the earlier they get the detection, the earlier they get the knowledge there's something going wrong, the quicker they can react by putting something in place on board. So for me, yes, there's a change in design possibly of ships, how they're going to deal with it for layouts or whatever we're going to work with. But before that, every ship could potentially have a screen on the bridge that says, 1, how many EVs are actually on the ship, and 2, if that EV is having or status of charge or has having a problem, in order that the crew react before it has become a bigger problem. And I think that, to me, would be what we should be looking at before anything else.
David, you've got any?
Yeah, I think
something else to add there.
I think the difficulty is you look at the runway of ship purchase and design, you're probably looking at 3 years at fastest, probably more like 5 or 6 in terms of getting these ships online. That's not going to be quick enough. I actually think there are several things that we can do in the meantime. Adrian and I have had many heated discussions. I personally think all vehicles should be plugged in, but not for charging, but for the very reason that Adrian said.
So you can get the diagnostics from the vessel, from the car, etc. Yeah.
I also think there are things that we can do which are much quicker. The vehicle manufacturers should be able to get together with them, with each other, and manage to find some kind of diagnostic test that the ferries can plug in, the ferry companies can plug in. So for all intents and purposes, they know that the battery's operating in a good condition. It's not reliant on a declaration, because with the best will in the world, there's going to be some person that's got the warning light on the dashboard that just wants to get home. You know, that's the reality of life. I also think something as simple as setting maximum charge for carriage of electric vehicles. I know it's going to be a real botheration for a lot of people. You know, you want to be fully charged when you get to Dover so you can do the first 200 miles. I think those days have got to end. I think there's got to be, I can't remember the numbers unless you can, Adrian, but something like at 50% of the charge, the risks are mitigated many, many times in terms of explosion and fire. You get the vapor, you get the coming out of it, but you may not get the fire. So if that's correct, then that's a simple thing that we can do. So rather than, you know, ultimately we will change the design of the ships, but do we know that changing the design of the ships for EVs is the right change? Because our you know, lithium-ion battery EVs actually here for permanent, or is there another step to come? So should we could be looking at to use that terrible management term, the low-hanging fruit first.
So port estates are going to have to find additional room for thousands of charging banks for EV vehicles when they come off the vessels.
Business opportunity.
I'm sure our friends at the Chamber of Shipping will be busy thinking about that sort of stuff. Ports like Dover.
British Ports
I suppose linked to this question, and it goes back to your idea about taking, you know, real-time diagnostics from the cars, etc. And it's come up in a couple of the questions on the slide. There is, can and should ship owners refuse to carry EVs, or only carry EVs if charterers or cargo owners are willing to take on the liability? And that perhaps that links into, if that technology does exist for something along the lines of real-time diagnostics, could that be made a condition of carriage, and how quickly could that happen? John, why don't we start with you on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I subject to sort of the inability to contract out of the unseaworthiness obligation, where the Hague or Hague-Bisbee rules apply as a matter of law. Carriers are entitled, from a legal perspective, to stipulate anything they want in their contracts. The obvious difficulty here is that there's a huge tension between what lawyers say they're entitled to do and what commercially they're able to do. So in some ways, it seems to me you're never going to get into a situation of, practically speaking, of the lawyers saying to the carriers, this is what you should do. It's going to be much more, I think, focused on technical solutions to try and improve safety.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I think here it would be ridiculous to suggest that we stop carrying electric vehicles. And it's just that there is a commercial imperative to do that. What can we do to make that as safe as possible? Well, we can train the crews appropriately. We can make sure that the shippers are providing as much information as they possibly can to assist the crews. And we can actually have a sensible discussion where neither party uses its commercial weight to say, actually, you'll do this regardless of the consequences, because what the shippers don't want is they don't want full vessels sinking in the middle of the Pacific, but at the same time, you know, they don't want the shippers to make it, the carriers to make it so prohibitively expensive or difficult for them to carry the cargo. I'm pretty sure that there are lots of solutions to this. It just involves us talking with all of the parties involved to sensibly get to something that suits all. And talking to one of the carriers, the stickers and the maximum charging levels, or having a shipping safe mode in the batteries that the OEMs can switch on and off, would pretty much satisfy them with some additional equipment fitted to the ships.
Just to
Yeah, sorry, go on.
jump in
Sorry,
very
yeah.
quickly, but one of the things that the whole reason I bring this subject up is we're talking at a level here in the room, which is the legal, we're talking at all the different bits and pieces, but from the videos I've shown today, very few people really appreciate how dangerous these vehicles can be when they fail, or if they fail, or where it's going. And the concern that I always go back to is the very base level is, at the moment, we've got the fire service that really don't know how to deal with this other than let it burn or stick it in a container full of water or come up with something. David's mentioned training the crews. If the fire service and the professional firefighters do not know how to deal with one of these fires, how are we expecting a crew member to be able to deal with that? And we talk about the training and the due diligence point that John's raised about the crew's training and how do you fight a fire. Ship's crews are trained to grab a fire hose and run into a space and try and put a fire out. You cannot do that with an EV. And that is a really nasty situation, because the training, if we don't know how to train, we can't train the crew. And what we're not telling the crews at the moment is the main hazards that may be generated. And when David raised it with me the other day, is that I believe with one of the cruise boats written in their policies about charging invalid carriages or charging the
Mobility
scooters, that's the word I was thinking of, all their things, allowed to charge them in the cabins by the front door when you're going to leave. So are they actually mentioning that if this starts or battery fails it's going into, is anybody being actually warned? Because the general public don't understand the potential hazards they're bringing into the houses. And how do we expect a crew to ever understand that either? And this is, for me, taking it back to that one stage before. If we don't understand, then how do we actually make sure the crews understand themselves?
This is the last question for me, and then we'll open it up to the physical audience, so to speak. But it feels to me that this is actually a loss prevention issue, and the guidelines and the strategies that we need to impart are those of a loss prevention nature. Because if thermal runaway does take place on board a vessel, we're probably looking at a total loss, would be my estimation. And to satisfy my own curiosity more than anything, particularly in the RoPax sector, how is there any work within the industry to look at those guidelines for safe evacuation of, well, firstly, the discovery and identification of EV fire, but then, of course, the safe evacuation, things like location of lifeboats, etc. And should this be a priority for the industry moving forward? Adrian, why don't we start with you on that one?
There are a lot of, and David raised it, there are a lot of little groups talking in little circles, but there doesn't seem to be a consensus of everybody working together to try and find a solution. So I know that the major Scandinavian Ro-Ro companies are working together to come up with solutions. Some of their solutions, like the fire blankets they talk about, which is great. All the ships now have a fire blanket on board. But trying to get it anywhere near a vehicle when you'd actually take all the context of, when you take it back and put it into the little Lego blocks of, okay, you've got a fire blanket, but can you actually physically get it to the vehicle and get it on top of the vehicle? And the answer is, in reality, no. So therefore, it's a sticking plaster that they've come up with to start with. So now they're looking at all the other options, and there's a lot of work being done, but sometimes you worry that it's being done by academics that aren't bringing in all of the factors that a seafarer would stand there. And I've been involved in shipping for a long time, and I've looked at two identical sister ships, but they're completely different actually on board and how they run. When you look at that, airlines are the same, but ships are completely different no matter which way you look at it. Points, different units in different areas. And so the training that we've got to go back to make everybody understand has to be done more globally, because it is a problem that we see. And for me, and I've said this, the very first time I was made aware of this problem or potential problem that's going through was from a second mate sailing on a cross-channel ferry, who raised it with me and said, we're carrying approximately 20% of electric vehicles on the road packs crossing the English Channel at the moment. But we have been given no guidance or understanding of what to do in the event of a fire. Can you help? This was a young person of the Donegal company who were talking it through. And from that point, 18 months down the line, I then attended a RoPax over in Greece that was on fire, and we don't think there was an EV involved, but we couldn't put the fire out. We couldn't touch anything. We couldn't do anything. We brought the ship into port. Luckily, it was in a port in the middle of nowhere. Because when you looked at it afterwards and what happened with the smoke and fumes and everything else with the ship burning, so once you've started the fire and it's going and everything's going up, I look at that and thought, well, if I was in Dover now, how many people's lives have I now affected by what's coming up with that ship with the toxic vapors or the fumes that have gone all over the vehicles in the car parks or whatever else? And there's a bit of humility that we've got to look as well, is while they're talking about charging all these vehicles on the ship that's crossing, how do we charge? Where's the power coming from to charge those vehicles on the ship? And the answer is when we're trying to reduce using fuels to run the ship across, so you're now actually going to be putting an extra generator on to actually charge them up.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the whole benefit of cutting down on fuel bills, you're actually increasing them by trying to charge a vehicle on the ship. And then when you're charging it, you're adding in that potential 26, 33% or whatever the figures were during that charging cycle. How are you charging them on board? How is that all going to work? And realistically, on an hour's crossing or a 2-hour crossing, how much charge are you actually physically going to put in the car of any benefit? And there's lots of little nuances like that. I don't think we understand yet what the consequences are. And the other point is, I mean, Tesla in the last 12 months have changed the systems already. They've changed the battery types they're putting in the car. They're changing the design to put up. The last I saw, they're putting a plastic base on the bottom of the vehicles below the batteries, so that in the event of a thermal runaway, the battery will drop out below the car so you can try and fight the fire. And I'm thinking that's a really good plan on a ship. So you've now got a battery potentially sliding across the deck when you're putting the water on it as well. And this is it's how we don't know what the manufacturers are changing.
And that goes back to the point originally about the due diligence side of this, is that when it's such a fast evolving industry, how on earth do you understand that risk? And therefore, how can you exercise proper due diligence?
Exactly.
Anyway, David, John, anything further to add to that before we wrap up some questions from the floor?
I mean, safe to say this, it's obviously ultimately a trade-off between cost and risk.
Of course.
Because I mean, if you put a quarter of the number of cars on a car deck and you had a fire blanket sitting beside every one, then you would reduce the risk greatly. But that's obviously going to come at an unacceptable cost. And I think the point that Adrian in particular is stressing is that if you look at the industry, it's probably got a bad track record of not looking at the risk until something catastrophic happens. And I think the important thing is to for the industry, both sides, with car manufacturers and carriers, to try and do something before that the risk is revealed to all by a catastrophe.
I think the problem is summed up by a post I saw on LinkedIn on Friday that a friend of mine sent, which was a ferry operator in the Baltic who proudly announced that they seem to have solved the problem by some kind of bath that you construct around a car. But of course, the photographs were taken on a vehicle deck with no other vehicles around the car, with no smoke on the vehicle deck, with a crew that were on site to do that specific task. And I'm sure that it does work. I'm sure in a perfect world that will work. And I'm not criticizing the particular people for their involvement, because it is a potential solution, but it's a potential solution for a given scenario that won't necessarily apply to all scenarios. And what we've got to get away from is working in an idealistic world to working in the real world.
Which is a key point.
Yeah.
And a key point being that in most cases that you ever see, whereas an incident on a ship, it's not a flat, calm day. It's usually got a little bit of you're rolling or you're pitching or there's something moving around that's caused that first problem to develop. And now it's not a flat platform. So everything you're now trying to do in that vehicle deck has got potentially things moving around it as well. And this is the point, is that when you're looking at global warming and you're looking at what we're seeing on the TV with the sea levels changing and the weather's changing, it's getting more intense and the wind speeds are getting stronger. All of these factors are adding into what the crews and what actually happen on ships, and the potential for these incidents occurring more often. We see it with the container ships where you're talking at the heights, the stacks moving about, but you've got electric batteries in. And if a battery can be damaged while it's in the wrong stow on the ship, you're now looking at a potential another situation where it's just adding to the mix. And the whole point here is raise the profile and people talking about it and trying to find the solutions. And I think the due diligence point is very valid. Looking at to come up with a global thing that works for everybody. it's all well and good having the blue chip companies come up with some great plans, but it's got to go. It's got to be a system that can be done by anybody on any type of ship.
Right. I'd now like to open the floor up for questions. James, you've got a question.
Have there been any examples of EV fires on ships that have been successfully fought, and if so, what lessons can be learned from those?
To my knowledge, no.
No,
I don't think.
no.
I've not come across any that have actually been fought and dealt with. I mean, obviously the key one is the Felicity Ace, which we believe was an EV fire, but we'll never know because we'll never actually get to find out what happened on board that one. The one I dealt with earlier this year, we don't believe there was any EVs, but we can't say for certain.
And I suppose this is another issue, I suppose, in understanding what happens in a thermal runaway event, is that maybe there has been, but has there actually been a confirmed casualty as a result of an EV fire yet at sea?
No, not that I'm certainly aware of.
No.
And this is the point that we're trying to get is we expect there will be one shortly, realistically, because when you look at if it's 20% of vehicles being carried at the moment on the cross-channel routes or on the PCTCs, they're probably 80% of the vehicles on board there now are going to be EVs, but they're carried with a certain level of charge. I think the ones we've been talking to, the requirement is a charge of between 30 and 50%, which I think makes sense. But again, these are vehicles that are all lashed down.
Yeah.
When you talk about the passenger vehicles, that's the one, or the domestic vehicles, so to speak, where people are charging them in different places around the country and they're plugging in, plugging out, and all those connections that are going on separately. That's where there's a challenge coming up, because you're relying on the general public to put a car on a ship that they've been driving potentially in France, that they may have had an accident in France and they're trying to get it home as quickly as possible, and whether there's problems that are coming through, and it's the difference. You've got control on the PCTC, in my view, in theory, bar second-hand ones, but generally you've got a good control. But when you're talking about the road tax industry, I mean, I went to Ireland a couple of weeks back for the claims conference in Dublin, and I drove up and drove on board within 20 minutes of that ship, and nobody looked at my car. Everybody said I just drove up, parked on, went up to the accommodation. How many EVs were on that trip? No idea. But when you're looking around the car parks and you're thinking hybrids have been on the market for 5, 6, 7 years now, the prices have been out a while. These batteries, when you talk to the experts, which we work with, guy from Professor Paul Christensen from Newcastle University, who's doing lots and lots of tests in working out what goes on. And he's saying, well, his presentation he gave to us was lithium-ion batteries are inherently unstable. The older they get, the worse they get.
I think what's interesting as well, Jos, is that if you read the MGN, it talks about what to do with vehicles that have been taken from one island to the mainland for repair. And it says, don't worry about body scrapes or dented bumpers or cracked windscreens. Well, that doesn't seem to reflect the real world. Adrian has a colleague that had a reasonably expensive pure EV and small fender bender, and the whole battery pack has been replaced because the OEM cannot guarantee that there was not sufficient damage in the battery pack. So they've replaced £22,000, I think.
Yeah, and that's the problem with the pure EVs. The battery is the chassis, so you don't need much of a collision on a motorway to potentially compress that battery in the crumple zones to then split the edge of a battery pack, where then you're driving in the winter and the salt spray and waters off the roads is now going into that battery that could potentially, and I say potentially, generate a problem that you're not aware of. And as I mentioned earlier, that in the States at the moment where the batteries are submerged because of the storm surge, now the corroding and the fire service are having to fight thermal runaways and fires in these vehicles because they were submerged in salt water. That's something that I don't think anybody ever considered as a problem previously. We certainly didn't.
I think what's interesting is that the risks are slightly different with road packs. So you're dealing with a greater variety of cars, which means a greater variety of battery ages, greater variety of care to those batteries. but you have drenches on a row pack, so even though they might not
Most
put,
of the time.
even though they might not put the fire out, they will perform some form of boundary cooling. So you do stand some chance of containing it, although it seems to me a higher degree of magnitude of risk. The problem with the pure car transporters is the suggestions we've heard is smothering systems. Just it's a bit like calcium hypochlorite. It's gonna have no effect. So even pumping the hold full of CO2 is going to be less effective than one would hope.
I think the answer lies in trains and bicycles.
On that note, we're 20. I've done a terrible job of moderating this session because we're 20 minutes over. The one thing that I've learned, one of my biggest takeaways, is an hour is not long enough to be discussing this issue with the breadth that it should be being discussed. But listen, I think that this has been a fantastic panel. I think one of the really refreshing things is actually there has been some substantive suggestions and advice in terms of how we can evolve and progress this conversation, which as far as I can see at this time is incredibly important. So I'd like to offer my huge thanks to the panelists who I think have done a fantastic job today. Everyone in the room, apologies for keeping you on, particularly if you're late for any meetings, etc. And of course to 400 participants that we had online. So on that note, thank you very much. And can I have a round of applause for our panelists?